Good morning. I've got my tea. It's been a cool week here in Greenville, the kind of October weather that makes the light look different, that makes you want to sit by the window and actually think about things rather than just moving through them, which is what I've been doing. I want to talk about the year before I retired, the last 12 months, and specifically about the list I made, the actual preparation I did, because I've had a lot of people in the comments asking about this. People who are a year out, 2 years out, trying to figure out what they're supposed to be doing. And I think the honest answer is more useful than the tidy one. Here's the honest answer up front. I made a checklist. I worked through it as carefully as I could. Most of it I got right. Some of it I got wrong. And there's one thing that wasn't on the list at all. That turned out to matter more than anything that was on it. I retired in March of 2021, exactly on schedule. The date came from a spreadsheet that my husband Frank had made years earlier when we sat at our kitchen table together and figured out what the plan looked like. National park trips, budget columns for 2, a tab he labeled post-career priorities, which sounds exactly like Frank. Organized, efficient, labeled. Frank died in October of 2019, and I kept the date anyway. I took it from the spreadsheet and I held on to it. It felt like keeping a promise to him, even though the promise was to us. That's the only way I know how to explain it. So the last 12 months of my working life, I was doing the consulting work still, which had become a lifeline I hadn't anticipated needing. I was doing all the preparation alone. The survivor benefit, the pension from the school system, what Medicare would look like, what the budget needed to be for one person now instead of 2. And I was doing all of it with his spreadsheet open on my laptop, updating columns he'd built and trying to stay focused on the work of it and not think too much about the fact that I was the only one updating them. This is the part nobody puts in the retirement brochure. Here's what I want to be honest about. The fear in that last year wasn't really about the money. I want to say that clearly because the money piece was complicated, and I'll tell you the numbers. I always want to be honest about the numbers. But the money wasn't the thing that made the last year hard. The fear was this. We had planned this together. The spreadsheet was his. The national park list was his. The retirement we'd talked about for years had a specific shape, and that shape had 2 people in it, and I was walking toward it alone. You wake up on a Saturday morning in the last year before retirement, and you open the spreadsheet to check something, and you notice that the column for Frank's pension income is still there, still filled in with his projected number. And you have to decide, do you delete it? Do you leave it? Do you update it to 0 and just move on? And that feels strange. Not the grief strange you'd expect to feel. Something more specific than that. Like erasing part of the plan feels like erasing part of him. And leaving it feels like lying to yourself about what the math actually is now. About what your life actually looks like. I sat with that column for about a week before I changed it. And I want to be honest that this is not just a widow's problem. Anytime you're going into retirement with a different picture than the one you planned, a divorce, a health change, a financial setback, a plan that was built for 2 that now needs to work for 1, you have some version of this moment. The moment where the plan meets the current reality and you have to update the spreadsheet to match what's actually true. I'm not going to give you a step-by-step guide to retirement planning. I'm not qualified for that, and I'll tell you plainly to find someone who is. What I can give you is what I actually did, and what I learned from doing it, and what I wish I'd known going in. That's all this is. Frank made the spreadsheet in 2016 or so, maybe 2015. I'm not exactly certain of the year, but it was years before retirement was on the near horizon for either of us. He was a planner. He'd been thinking about this for years before I was ready to think about it seriously. I was still in the middle of the curriculum coordinator work, still running school schedules and managing people and feeling like there was plenty left to do before I could sit down and think about what came after. But he had the spreadsheet, and in that spreadsheet was a row for what our Social Security would look like if we both claimed at the right time. A row for my pension from the school system, a row for his pension from his years in county administration, a row for the National Park List, which was its own tab, columns for expenses, for the house that was paid off, for what the comfortable life looked like on our actual numbers. He'd even put in a notes column for things he wasn't sure about yet, contingencies, questions to revisit. And then October 2019 arrived, and the spreadsheet was still there on the laptop, and Frank wasn't. In the spring of 2020, I was still consulting then, still working, the job that had become a lifeline in ways I hadn't expected to need. I sat down with the laptop and I opened every tab. And I started, slowly and deliberately, going through what the numbers looked like now. Just mine. Just what I had. The column for Frank's county pension, 0. His Social Security, which we'd planned to use in the way we'd planned. I'd need to understand the survivor benefit situation carefully before I made any decisions. I knew the survivor benefit existed. I didn't know the numbers. I wrote it in the notebook, the one I'd started keeping after October. Margin note. Figure out the survivor benefit before anything else. That was the beginning of the checklist. That note in the margin of a worn notebook, sitting at the kitchen table with his spreadsheet open, updating columns I hadn't needed to update before. So I want to go through 5 things that were on that checklist, the ones that actually mattered, and one thing that wasn't on it. If any of this applies to your situation, I hope it's useful. If your situation is different, some of it still might be. The first thing on the checklist, understand the survivor benefit before you do anything else. I want to be honest about the numbers here because I think vague is not helpful. When Frank died, I was entitled to his Social Security as a survivor benefit. That's different from my own Social Security. It's based on his earnings record, not mine, and it works differently than I understood going in. The amount you can receive, when you can claim it, how it interacts with your own benefit. I genuinely did not know these things before I had to know them. What I eventually understood after a lot of reading and one very helpful appointment at the Social Security office is that you can take the survivor benefit at one point and your own benefit later, or vice versa. Depending on which is larger and when you claim them, the math works out differently. This is not simple. It took me several weeks to feel like I understood it well enough to make a decision. My survivor benefit, when I claimed it, came to about $1,580 a month. My own Social Security, I held off on that for a while, added more later. Together with my pension from the school system, I landed about $3,130 a month total. That's the real number, and it's the number I built the rest of the plan around. If you are widowed and you don't fully understand the survivor benefit situation, I would say put that at the top, before anything else. It affects everything downstream. The second thing, the pension decision is not reversible, and I almost got it wrong. My pension from the school system, 37 years of teaching and coordinator work, which adds up to something I'm genuinely grateful for, I had options for how to take it. There was a standard option that maximized my monthly amount, and there were several survivor options at different percentages that would reduce my monthly payment, but provide some benefit to a designated survivor if I died. The thing I didn't immediately understand was that this decision, once made, is permanent. You choose, you file the paperwork, and whatever you chose is what you have for the rest of your life. There is no going back and adjusting it later when your circumstances change. There is no appeal process. You make the call before you retire, and then you live with it. Frank had always been the one who thought through these kinds of decisions with great care. He was precise in a way that I admired and occasionally found slightly maddening. He made pro and con lists. He asked follow-up questions. He read the documents twice. And I was used to us making these decisions together, which meant that when I was suddenly facing a significant financial decision alone, I felt the absence of that particular skill set acutely. Frank would have had an opinion about this. He would have had several opinions about this in descending order of confidence, and he would have shared all of them. I ended up calling my sister Patty. She'd retired 2 years before me. She's been something of an advanced scout in my life, going through things slightly ahead of me, and she'd navigated a similar pension decision. She talked me through it over the phone for about an hour and a half. By the end of that conversation, I understood the trade-offs well enough to make a decision I felt confident in. She may have saved me from making a mistake that would have followed me for the rest of my retirement. The lesson, if I can call it that, this particular decision deserves more time and more conversation than you might think it does. If there's someone in your life who has been through it, ask them to sit with you. Don't do it in a hurry, and don't do it alone if you can avoid it. The third thing, Medicare is more complicated than it looks, and the parts that are complicated are not the parts they tell you about up front. I want to be honest about the numbers. I want to be honest about them because I think people in my situation, single income, careful budget, doing this alone, need to know what they're actually working with before they can make good decisions. A Medicare supplement plan, which fills in the gaps that original Medicare doesn't cover, costs me $194 a month. That's in addition to the Part B premium, which comes out of my Social Security automatically before I see the check. Together, my health coverage costs are a meaningful line in my monthly budget. Meaningful enough that I needed to understand them precisely before I retired, not afterward when I was already living on the fixed amount. What I didn't fully understand going in was the Medigap enrollment window. There's a period, right when you turn 65, or when you first enroll in Medicare Part B, where you have what the government calls a guaranteed issue right. In that window, insurance companies cannot refuse to sell you a Medigap policy or charge you more based on your health history. That window is limited. It closes. And if you miss it, enrolling later can be substantially harder and more expensive, especially if you have any health conditions. I got this right, barely, and partly because someone at the Medicare class I attended at the public library specifically mentioned it and wrote it on the board. Without that class, I might have missed the window entirely. The class was free. It was at the library on a Thursday afternoon. I went once, took careful notes, and then I went back a second time because I hadn't understood everything the first time. Frank would have said I didn't need to go twice. He would have been wrong about that. The fourth thing, the budget math had to become real math, not theoretical math. Frank's spreadsheet had beautiful, careful projections, but they were projections made when we were both going to be in the picture. When I updated them, when I made the columns reflect what was actually true, I had to look at what a single person's retirement on my specific income would cost. I want to be honest about the numbers here. My fixed monthly expenses, the house, which is paid off, so utilities and taxes and maintenance, come to around $450 in a typical month. Health coverage is a little under $200. Food, which I've gotten more careful about, runs about $260 to $280. Church, small giving, and occasional things, maybe another $200. Add it up, and my comfortable baseline is somewhere around $1,100, $1,150 a month, which means on 3130 I have meaningful room. Not extravagance, not what the two-person plan would have felt like, but room. And understanding that room, knowing that I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life worried about whether I could make it, That changed how I felt going into March 2021. What Frank had done with that spreadsheet was give me the framework. What I did in the last year was make it honest. Take out the two-person assumptions, put in the real numbers, look at the result. It was hard to do, and it was necessary to do. The fifth thing, and this one is harder to put on a checklist because it doesn't belong on a checklist in the normal sense. I had to figure out what retirement was going to look like without Frank's plans in it. The national park list was his. He'd made it over years, quietly, the way he did things that mattered to him. Parks he wanted to see, ranked loosely in some system that made sense to him. Notes about seasons and routes and the practical considerations, how long to allow, where to stay, what time of year the crowds thinned. He'd researched these things the way he researched everything he cared about, thoroughly, without making a production of it. And I had to decide in the last year before I retired what to do with that list, whether to carry it forward into a retirement that was going to look very different from the one we'd planned, whether to go to those parks on his timeline, in his order, by his suggested routes, whether to make it mine or leave it his, or whether to put it away entirely and start over with something that was purely my own. I kept it. I kept his ranking and his notes and his margin comments, and I've gone back to it. Not always to the parks he ranked highest, not always in the order he suggested, but I've gone. I went to the Smoky Mountains last spring, which was on the list, and he would have had an opinion about the weather on the second day. I know exactly what he would have said, and I smiled about it on the trail, which was either grief or something else, and I've stopped trying to classify it too precisely. I don't fully understand, even now, why keeping the list mattered so much. I don't know if it was the right decision or just the one I needed to make at the time. What I know is that sitting with the question deliberately, in the last year, thinking carefully about who I wanted to be in retirement and what I wanted to carry into it, was its own kind of preparation. And it didn't fit in any column in the spreadsheet. Frank would have said I was overthinking it. He probably would have said, "Just go, Carol, just pick a park and go." He might have been right. He was right more often than I always admitted in the moment. 2.5 years into retirement now, I kept the date from his spreadsheet, and I went into it as prepared as I could make myself on my own. Some of it I got right. The survivor benefit I navigated. It took several weeks and one very patient appointment at the Social Security office and more reading than I expected, but I got it right. The pension decision I got right with Patty's help and more time than I initially planned to give it. Medicare I enrolled in correctly and within the window. The budget I understood well enough going in that I wasn't surprised by what retirement actually cost. The thing I didn't get right was how long it would take for retirement to feel like mine. Not ours, mine. That's a different transition than the financial one, and it doesn't complete on any particular schedule. Some days it still feels like I'm living in a plan that was made for two people, and I'm the one who stayed behind in it. And some days it feels exactly right, exactly like a life I'm actually living rather than one I inherited. Some days are better than others. Last week had some good days. I'm not going to say I have it all figured out. That wouldn't be accurate. But the checklist helped. The preparation helped. Having thought through as much as I could in that last year meant that when March 2021 arrived, I wasn't scrambling. I was ready, or ready enough. And ready enough, I've decided, is actually the only kind of ready there is. If any of this is useful to you, I'd like to hear what you're working through. Specifically, I'm curious about this. What's the one thing on your retirement preparation list that you weren't expecting to be complicated? The thing that looks simple from the outside and turned out to have more to it than you anticipated. Leave it in the comments. I read them carefully every week, and they tell me more about what's worth talking about than almost anything else. Particularly from widows who are doing this math alone, or from anyone who is navigating this with a different plan than the one they started with. I want to make sure I'm covering the parts that actually matter. And if you're in the last year before retirement right now, if that's where you are, I want to say this. The preparation matters, and it's worth the time, and also you won't get it perfectly right, and that's okay. Nobody does. What you're trying to do is get it right enough that the surprises are manageable rather than catastrophic. That's the real goal. Not perfection, manageable. Frank used to say that the purpose of a plan isn't to predict the future. It's to make sure you've thought about it. I think he was right about that. He usually was. I'm planning a video soon on the house question, whether to stay in this house or sell. I've been sitting with it for 2 years and I don't have a clean answer, which probably means it's the right time to talk about it out loud. Subscribe if you want to catch that. And thank you for being here. I mean that in the specific sense, not as a thing I say at the end of videos, but as something I actually mean. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to say. Thanks for being here.